After you read the stimulus, the argument, and logical reasoning, especially when it's long, you want to look at the question stem and ask, what part of this passage actually matters? If the question's about the main point, you don't want to sweat every single little detail. If it's a weakened question, focus on the author's reasoning, not the background. The question stem helps you narrow your attention so you're not trying to hold everything in your head. Now, for the longer logical reasoning questions, don't be afraid to mark the conclusion, any shifts in the argument, any weird words or definitions. Even just circling one or two phrases can help you keep your grounding. And so, for this reason, we tell our students it's not about how much you underline, it's about underlining the right things. These long arguments don't have to be your enemy, they're just regular arguments with more decoration. So don't let their length psych you out. Focus on the structure, use the question stem to narrow in, and don't be afraid to rewrite confusing sentences in your own words. Once you build this muscle, you're going to start to love the longer logical reasoning passages because most people avoid them, which means free points for you. Now, let's suppose you're cruising through logical reasoning and then you hit one of those questions with no real world topic, no clear facts, just vague terms like a justification for a general principle, a prescriptive claim, or an abstract standard of fairness. So, in these cases, your brain immediately goes, what are they even talking about? Totally normal reaction. And most people hate these questions. But the good news is, you don't need a philosophy degree to crush them. You just need a strategy. Now, abstract logical reasoning questions feel hard because they sound hard. But behind the fancy words is usually a very basic idea. Your first move should be to zoom out and ask, what is the author trying to argue? What is this really about? You're not looking for deep insight here. You're just trying to anchor yourself in the argument because even abstract arguments still have premises and conclusions. So the first thing you want to do is rewrite the entire thing in plain English. Obviously, don't do that on test day, but do it during your review. So let's say the stimulus said, for example, quote, any policy that restricts autonomy without demonstrable benefit is unjustifiable. Let's simplify it. If a rule limits freedom and doesn't help anybody, it's a bad rule. Much easier. You are allowed, encouraged even, to rephrase abstract ideas in your own words. That's how you stop feeling lost. And with abstract questions, as always, the topic doesn't really matter at all. What matters is the structure of the argument. So if the stimulus says, quote, an action is morally wrong if it disrespects human dignity, since lying disrespects dignity, it's wrong. You don't need to debate the ethics of lying here. You've just got to see the form. The rule says if A requires B, fact A, conclusion B. That is clean, clear logic, just wrapped up in big words. We have the conditional, we have the sufficient condition activating that, then we have the necessary automatically following. So you want to slow down and ask, does this answer match the structure of the argument? Is it making the same kind of argument or something slightly different? And remember, if the stimulus is abstract, the right answer will usually mirror that level of abstraction. So don't pick something that suddenly talks about a specific scenario unless the question tells you to. And of course, the more you practice these abstract questions, especially parallel reasoning and principle application, the more comfortable you're going to get. And you'll start to realize it's just pattern recognition. So for our students, we typically strip away the content entirely and just use variables so they can focus on the shape of the argument. If you do that enough times, even the scary abstract questions turn into free, easy points. Now, abstract logical reasoning, like anything on the LSAT, is all about pattern recognition. You translate and you stay calm under pressure. You don't run, you don't freeze, you just translate and look for structure. Now, let's talk about the big picture issue a lot of students face, which is mixing up different kinds of questions. So let's step back and compare them side by side. Every single one of these question types in logical reasoning is about evaluating arguments. That means the stimulus contains a conclusion and premises that try to support it. And your job is to ask, Does this argument actually make sense? That is the starting point for every single assumption family question. Before anything else, ID the conclusion. That is your anchor. Now, one of the big types that trip people up is necessary assumption versus sufficient assumption. So let's break it down. Necessary assumption questions are asking you for something that must be true in order for the argument to work. Meaning, if this isn't true, the whole thing falls apart. That's why you want to use the negation test. In contrast, for sufficient assumption questions, you want something new that, if true, would guarantee the conclusion. Think to yourself, if this is true, the conclusion follows 100%. These are often much stronger and often more specific. The key difference is that necessary assumption questions are all about holding the argument together. Sufficient is about proving the conclusion. So the problem is, if you pick a sufficient answer on a necessary question, what you've chosen is too strong. If you pick a necessary answer on a sufficient question, it's not strong enough. That's why people get confused. Now, another common mistake is strengthen versus weaken, mixing those up. These are, of course, more intuitive, but still easy to confuse in the moment. For a strengthener, you want to make the argument more convincing. For a weakener, you want to make the argument less convincing. You're not proving or disproving anything, you're just adding or removing support. And by the way, if the argument's weak, a strengthened answer will often fill a gap. If the argument's strong, a weakened answer will often show a hidden flaw. So you've got to understand where the argument is vulnerable and then see which answer addresses that spot. Now, flaw questions are a little different. Instead of asking you to help or hurt the argument, they ask you to name the error in the reasoning. It's like being a coach reviewing a bad play. You're asking, what went wrong here? So the focus isn't on changing the argument, it's on diagnosing the problem. That's why so many flaw answers use phrases like confuses, fails to consider, or presumes without justification. Now, evaluate questions are kind of an oddball. They ask, which one of the following would be most helpful to know in assessing the argument? In other words, what question could you ask that would test whether the argument is strong or weak? You're not strengthening or weakening yet. You're deciding what info would help you decide. That's a subtle shift, but a huge one. It's like saying, before I give an opinion, I need more data, and here's the data I would want. Now let's talk about principal strengthening questions. These work just like regular strengthen, but the correct answer is more abstract. It's a rule that supports the argument. As for parallel flaw, it's just like parallel reasoning, but you're matching bad logic, not good logic. So if the argument makes a correlation causation error, so too should the correct answer. As always, it's not about the topic, it's about the type of mistake. Now let's shift gears and talk about the inference family of questions. These will feel different from assumption family, of course, because the stimulus is not necessarily an argument. No conclusion, no reasoning to evaluate, just facts. And your job is to read those facts carefully, then figure out what must logically follow. But even within this family, you've got three common types that love to mess with people. You've got must be true, most strongly supported, and cannot be true. So let's talk about how these are different from each other and how to avoid getting tricked. Must be true is the gold standard. It's the strictest question type. You're looking for something that is 100% guaranteed to be true based only on what's stated in the stimulus. Not probably true, not feels true, must be true. That means no outside knowledge, no assumptions, no maybe language. If it's not directly supported by the facts, it's out. And the wrong answers here will often sound tempting, but they add new info or they overreach. So you want to stick to what's actually said. Now, most strongly supported is still close, but a bit softer. You still want something that is supported by the passage, but it doesn't have to be ironclad. It's just got to be the best supported choice, even if it's not airtight. The key difference is must be true requires 100% certainty, and most strongly supported is probably true based on the facts. So the right answer might not be directly stated, but it flows naturally from what is. Now, cannot be true flips the script. Instead of looking for what's supported, you're looking for the thing that violates the information in the stimulus. If the stimulus says all cats are mammals and the answer says some cats are not mammals, that cannot be true. These questions are testing whether you can spot logical contradictions. So you want to look for choices that look neutral but actually break the rules. Cannot be true answers often look innocent until you realize they flat out disagree with the facts. Now, for all inference questions, you want to make sure you read carefully because these are detail based. You don't need to analyze structure, but you do need to be precise. You also don't want to predict too much because these are not about filling the gap like in assumption questions. You want to stay close to the actual text. You also want to eliminate aggressively. Wrong answers often overreach. If it goes even one step beyond the facts, you want to cut it out. Also, look for quantifiers. Words like some, all, many, must, likely, and can change everything. So make sure that you don't ignore them. It's all about careful reading. So slow down, be methodical, and don't let the LSAT sneak in new ideas disguised as common sense. If it wasn't in the stimulus, it's not your friend. Now, let's talk about parallel versus parallel flaw questions. These two types confuse a lot of students, and I get it. They both start off the same way. They ask, which one of the following most closely parallels the reasoning above? And they both give you long, dense answer choices that feel like mini stimuli. But the difference is, parallel reasoning is asking you to match the argument regardless of validity. Parallel flaw tells you that you're matching a flawed or bad argument. Same format, slightly different goal. So let's break down how to tell them apart and how to beat both of them. But first, you got to know what the question's even asking. Check the question stem. Look for keywords like flawed reasoning, erroneous reasoning, or parallels the flawed reasoning above. If you see that language, you're doing parallel flaw. If the question just says parallels the reasoning above, with no judgment, it's regular parallel reasoning. With parallel reasoning, you're matching structure and validity. With parallel flaw, you're matching structure and the error. If you don't notice the distinction, you might get wrecked by trap answers. Now, the first thing you want to do is boil the argument down to its skeleton. That is the most important step for both of these types. You cannot just skim. You've got to strip it down to its core logic. First, you ID the conclusion and the premises. Then you rephrase them in abstract terms. And finally, you want to note whether the argument is flawed or valid. For example, if they said all cats are animals, Fluffy is a cat, therefore Fluffy is an animal, the structure would be all A's are B's, X is A, therefore X is B. That is valid logic. So for a parallel reasoning question, you want another answer with that exact form. In contrast, we have parallel flaw. For example, all surgeons are doctors, Bob is a doctor, therefore Bob is a surgeon. Might look similar, but this one is flawed, classic reversal. The structure here would be all A's are B's, X is B, therefore X is A. Incorrect, invalid, flawed. So for parallel flaw, you want another argument that makes the same kind of mistake. Now here's the big trap. A lot of wrong answers on the LSAT will match the topic, but not the logic. If the stimulus is about dogs, they'll give you choices about cats, horses, maybe even squirrels. Doesn't matter. You're not matching the topic, you're matching the structure. Once you find answers with the same structure, then you want to check to see, is the logic valid or is the same flaw repeated? That's what you want to look for. And for parallel flaws, they love to repeat the same old greatest hits like correlation causation, necessary sufficient confusion, circular reasoning, and scope shifts. So if you spot a familiar flaw in the stimulus, you want to label it right away. That'll help you find the matching flaw faster in the answer choices. Now, I know that these two parallels both seem intimidating, but they're actually quite mechanical. You strip down the stimulus, match the structure, and double check for the logic, whether it's valid or flawed. It's like matching blueprints rather than painting a picture. And once you get the hang of it, these questions become predictable, and sometimes they can even be fun. Yes, really.